Act 1. The Hammer of the King. Clang, clang, clang. The smashing of Abdul-Ahad's blacksmith hammer echoed like the seismic clap of a thunderbolt dancing on the horizon. This particular blacksmith hammer had been passed down from generation to generation. The handle was bound in an ancient black leather and scarred by the relentless bombardment of toil. A toil Abdul-Ahad was becoming all too familiar with. Sparks flung from the anvil and splashed over the anvil like embers carelessly tossed from a fire pit. Abdul-Ahad momentarily paused his brawny barrage on the anvil to lament the oncoming winter. The Panjshir Valley was impassable by the middle of winter, locking in the residents to shelter in place for months on end. Lately, Abdul-Ahad's thoughts drifted, setting sail in his mind, a voyage beyond the endless mounds of the Panjshir Valley. At the basin of the valley lay a secluded village. For 7 generations, Abdul-Ahad's family had called that village home. "Is it supper time already?" "Forgive me, father. My mind was a wander." Azim obligingly outstretched his right hand, gesturing his reluctant son to relinquish the blacksmith hammer. He flipped the hallowed hammer and tilted the hefty handle in the direction of his foreboding father. Time cleansed the hammer of any distinguishable markings that once may have existed. Azim gripped the hammer with a renewed sense of vigor and ran his thumb down the shaft of the handle, stopping at the base. "Believe it or not, your grandfather and I used to speak of similar grandeur. The world beckoned to him, as it does you. But our place is here, my son. Like this anvil, we are anchored to this land," Azim said, while gently striking the anvil with the palm of his hulking hand. As Azim finished speaking, the sun began to set behind his sinewy shoulders. A striking shadow loomed over the hut and crept into the room. The humid valley had tarnished his salubrious skin, darkening the hue to a crisp golden brown. His wavy white hair wafted in the southerly breeze like the tattered blades of lovegrass scattered along the riverbed of the valley. Azim's facial hair was as white as a cow's breath beneath the morning mist. "I know, father." "And yet, some undisguisable urge calls on you. A girl, perhaps." "Father, I wish I knew. My mind wanders like leaves fall from a tree in autumn," Abdul-Ahad said while staring at the imperfections in the sublime family heirloom. Time had worn away the once pristine anvil, whittling away the custom engravings. The once prominent markings now faintly resembled factious words, no more distinguishable than inscriptions on an ancient sarcophagus. Scars embedded deep into the anvil, like the superficial wounds on a battle-tested shield. "Your grandfather once told me that a man's destiny is not described at birth. Your destiny can be shaped as easily as we use the hammer to bend a piece of iron. It has been many winters since your grandfather passed his hammer down to me. In 2 more winters, I will be ready to pass it down to you. Then you can shape your own destiny. If it is your will to leave the village, then I will respect your decision. But not until then. Your family needs you." Abdul-Ahad breathed deeply and silently as his benevolent father examined the hammer. Azim started patting the head of the blacksmith hammer with his palm and asked his son, "Have I ever told you the origins of this hammer?" Abdul-Ahad nodded and answered, "Father, you weaned me on that story. I must have heard it over 1,000 times." Azim smirked at his son's newfound candidness and cavalier attitude. He gently placed the hammer down on the anvil, like a widow laying a bouquet of flowers at the head of a tombstone. "One more time won't kill you then." HOTK was inscribed into the handle of this hammer. Right here, the king himself, King Darius, wrote the inscription into the handle. He wrote that inscription. Azim perspicaciously paused for a moment to articulate his tedious thoughts. He wrote that inscription to honor the hard work and dedication of our great-grandfather. To honor... Abdul paused for a moment to let his father reclaim his train of thought. As of late, Azim had found storytelling a tortuous task. Azim smiled at his firstborn son and said, "To honor our craftsmanship, to honor our family, to honor our heritage. This hammer is not just a hammer. This hammer is a symbol of our stewardship. We owe this land, our land, to our king and to our hard work." Azim picked up the blacksmith hammer and started to walk around the workshop. He placed the hammer down on one of the workbenches next to the only window in the room. The workshop was attached to the hut and no larger than a barn. As he walked out of the workshop, he paused to pat his son on the shoulder. It was the kind of firm, reassuring pat on the back that only a son could truly appreciate. An hour passed, and then another. As Abdul-Ahad glanced out of the window, the sun began to slowly lower behind the apex of the mound. It was at that very moment, as the sun set, Abdul-Ahad felt the renewed urge to chase the fleeting beams on the horizon. He sprang up from his workbench and set forth, like bees humming mindlessly back to a hive. He brushed across a broom and oafishly stumbled through the doorway, knocking down a few accoutrements in his path. A large, shadowy outline of a man cascaded over Abdul-Ahad. "Where are you off to in such a hurry?" Azim asked his son in the kind of stern tone of voice that straightened his spine. Before he could finish blurting out his response, Abdul-Ahad's mother gracefully crept into the workshop. This was the territory of the home she rarely ever ventured. "He is running away, just like his father did so many years ago. In fact, isn't that how we met?" Azim tilted his head slightly and folded his arms in a stubborn form of protest. His forearms swelled as they pressed up against the lower part of his chest. "Rayla, his place is here. Next winter he will be a man. He must leave these childish aspirations behind." Rayla delicately placed her left hand on the back of Azim's shoulder and began to gently massage his backside. The years of pounding away on the anvil left a lasting mark on Azim's body. His shoulders were left swollen, yet withered. His back rounded, yet brittle. His neck girthy, yet encapsulated with sun-damaged scars. "Husband, the sun will set on the horizon, but the anvil will be right here when he returns home," she said while snugly embracing her husband. "Father, I won't be long. I swear it." Azim swatted the supple hand of his slender wife and quickly rose from his chair. He walked over to his crestfallen son and picked him from the ground. He placed his hand on the cheek of his son and began to slowly nod. "Go on, my son," Azim said begrudgingly to his exuberant son. Azim breathed a heavy sigh of relief to know his son was finally growing up to be a man. His youthful jubilance restored the old man's sensibility and zest for life. Abdul's eyebrows arched higher than the crests of the tallest mounds along the valley. He beamed a smile and hugged his father. As he turned and ran out the door, his father interrupted him by saying, "Be back before darkness falls." "I will, father." Abdul-Ahad ran faster than a rabbit scurrying away from a hungry mountain lion. As he scaled the mound overlooking the village, his home became nothing more than a distant memory. He eagerly explored the land, like an archaeologist investigating an ancient undiscovered tribal burial ground. Abdul-Ahad looked around the mound and spotted a clearing down by the riverbed. As he rushed down the backside of the mound, the valley darkened, and the shadows of the forest soaked the ground. His breathing hastened to a rapid pace, like a fish out of water, gasping for air. His eyes began to gloss over. His mind was willing, but his body forced him down to a snail's crawl. Abdul took a moment to refocus himself and recenter his mind's eye. "This might be a good place to take a rest," he said aloud to an empty field. Abdul-Ahad planted his hands firmly on his hips and began to slowly recover his breathing. His racing heartbeat began to level off. Before he knew it, the valley was swallowed by total darkness. Abdul had noticed the fading sunlight, but was intent to soak up every second of his adventure. A distant thump pulled Abdul out of his momentary trance. It was a faint sound, at first barely recognizable or discernible from ambient noise in the valley. Abdul thought very little of it at first. Again, the tremble of another thump terrorized his ears. Abdul turned his head to the source of the sound. It was the other side of the mound. Thump, thump, thump. The tantalizing thumping grew in severity and frequency, but Abdul could not make heads or tails of the noise. "I'm not fond of sleeping in the forest. Might be the time to head back home," he said aloud to an empty forest. Thump, thump, thump. The eminence of the thumping escalated in severity as Abdul climbed the mound. Abdul-Ahad distraughtly shook his head in a moment of pure confusion. The source of the noise eluded him, like an apprentice to the apothecary deciphering a recipe written in Latin. Abdul slowly trudged up the backside of the mound and made his way back to the village. Before ascending the crest of the mound, he sucked a scent of smoke into his nasal passage. Abdul shook his head and scampered on the top of the mound. As he stood on the top of the mound, the color drained from Abdul's face. His beatific bronze skin turned as white as the winter snowstorm. No. Abdul's knees buckled and he fell to the ground. His village was set ablaze, like a wildfire ripping through a field of rye. The walls of the huts crumbled to the ground, falling like limbs from a rotting cypress tree. Abdul's heart started pounding. His blood began to boil. His veins pulsated with pure rage. He ran down the mound with the ferocity of a stampeding pack of bulls. Hut after hut was scorched. He ran to his home with flagrant disregard for his own life. Embers smacked him in the face. Poignant plumes of pernicious smoke pranced around him. His furious pace was halted by an unbearable opulent odor. Tears careened down his eyes like the flow of water down a river, obscuring his vision, but heightening his other senses. Abdul planted his knees deep into the soil in front of his home. For all that remained of his beloved home was his anvil. Clang, clang, clang. Abdul swiveled his head in the direction of the melancholic noise. He hastily jumped up from the ground and dashed towards the direction of the noise. The familiar sound of his blacksmith's hammer cleansed the tears from his eyes. The smoke draped over the remnants of the village, like the black shroud over the face of a widow at her husband's funeral service. "My hammer," he said under his breath. The steam protruded from his mouth, like smoke out of a chimera's nostrils. Abdul-Ahad started fervently searching around for the source of the sound. For a moment, his mind tricked him into thinking this was all merely just a dream. For a moment, his naive mind lulled him into a false sense of security. For a moment, he was foolish enough to hope. Then in a moment, he realized the nightmare had just begun. 3 large men were surrounding a campfire outside of the nearest charred hut. One of the men was slamming Abdul's hammer against a rock. He struggled to slam the hammer with any meaningful force. The balance of a blacksmith's hammer was far different from that of a sword. The other 2 men chuckled at their comrade's incompetence. Without a moment's compunction, Abdul-Ahad roared a deafening shriek at the top of his lungs and sprang towards the groggy trio. Two of the men crookedly stumbled around the campfire. The man feebly attempted to swing the hammer, but Abdul rushed him and tackled him into the campfire. Abdul and the man rolled around the campfire, kicking and screaming like two out-of-control hyenas. The larger man tossed Abdul off and stumbled back up to his feet. He slowly unsheathed his sword, with the two other men looking onward in a drunken stupor. Each of the men barely able to keep standing, swaying in the wind like blades of grass caught in a breeze. The man stomped on Abdul's right arm and raised his sword high into the air. Abdul looked to his left and saw his hammer covered in dirt. In one fell swoop he snagged the hammer and swung it with the force of all his ancestors. In one swooping motion, the hammer detached the lower extremity clean off the man's kneecap. The man dropped his sword to the ground and screamed at the top of his lungs. After hobbling on a single leg, he fell sideways onto the campfire. Abdul jumped to his feet and slammed the hammer down on the man, peppering his body with blows from the hammer. The two men forcefully exchanged screams. The onlookers were unable to decipher who was screaming louder. Abdul-Ahad pulverized what was left of the man's corpse. Chunks of bone flung around the campfire, like a butcher pounding a bunch of ground beef with a mallet. Abdul-Ahad picked himself up from the torrid, blood-soaked ground. His veins throbbed with an acute burst of adrenaline. His anger subsided as he turned his focus on the other two men. His eyes myopically focused on the other two men, trained on them like a hungry hawk staring down a rabbit. He avulsed the hammer from the Sassanian corpse and pointed it at the other two men. They each stood about 10 feet away from Abdul, their haggard hands cloistered on the hilts of their scummy swords. Chunks of their dead comrade drooped off the hammer's face and slipped into the embers of the campfire. Abdul's fully outstretched arm did not waver, not an inch. It was not muscle that raised up that hammer. Rage had raised up that hammer. Vengeance had raised up that hammer. Justice had raised up that hammer. Abdul slowly lowered the hammer and shrieked at the top of his lungs. The steam from his breath fumed out of his mouth like the pyroclastic blast of a volcanic eruption. His gallant grip tightened around the handle of the blacksmith hammer. The skin around his knuckles turned pale white, and his face swelled red with blood. He lunged towards the men, and without a moment's hesitation, they fled like cowards into the hills. Abdul-Ahad's mouth dripped with a cocktail of blood, saliva, and adrenaline. His eyes swirled as he pathetically plunged to the ground, tumbling as hard as a sack of potatoes tossed from a carriage. On the next day, the sun slowly rose over the mound and blanketed the belly of the valley. Abdul-Ahad's eyes were severely swollen and profanely puffy. His eyelids crept open like a drunkard awakening from a halcyon hangover. He instinctively raised his hand up to block the bothersome beams of the sunlight. Abdul-Ahad lingered on the ground, not wanting to accept the reality of what transpired the night before. The soil was as madescent as Amazonian quicksand. His mind urged him to get up, but alas, his body was unwilling. The smoke from the fire had subsided, and all that remained of his village were piles of ash and settee. Abdul-Ahad carelessly dropped his hand and stared at the sun, with a shameful disregard for his own well-being. As he lay there, baking in the sun, a faint squishing sound approached him from behind. Abdul-Ahad didn't so much as flinch. Part of him eagerly invited in the danger to alleviate his endless sorrow. A large shadow carelessly crept over his body. The shadowy figure blotted out the sun from overhead. The foreign man was slender, yet oddly bulky in the upper torso. Am I dead? The mysterious man scoffed and said, Dead? No, you're not dead. Fortunately for you, the crows have been feasting on your friend over there. Are you going to kill me? Abdul-Ahad pathetically asked the cumbrous stranger. Kill you? Quite the contrary. By the looks of it, we will need every man we can get our hands on. Abdul-Ahad raised his hand to shade his eyeballs from the immense glare of the sunlight. He hoped to get a better look at the swarthy stranger standing over him. As he raised his hand up, the stranger grabbed on and plucked Abdul-Ahad from the ground. He plucked him as easily as a farmer plucking a potato from the soil. Abdul-Ahad belched out a reluctant, irritated gasp. The man flung him over his shoulder and tossed him onto a camel, like a fishmonger tossing a fish into an icebox. The man pulled out a blanket from his saddlebag and clandestinely covered the young blacksmith. The albino camel plopped down on all fours and waited for the stranger to give a command. The stranger took a second to go inspect the rotting corpse of the vanquished warrior. His corpse was roasted, dangling by the campfire and bludgeoned beyond recognition. He closely examined the antiquated armor, the various pieces of cloth scattered around the campfire, and some of the abhorrent armaments. I've seen these markings before, so it's true then. Sassanians, he said while frolicking around the campfire. Thump, thump, thump. A distant thumping immediately alerted the old man into a frenzy, like a dog perking up after a car alarm. He sprang up from the ground and began to scan the devastated campsite for any other survivors. The man placed his fingers between his lips and erupted a loud whistle. Jamal, the stranger shouted to his camel. The camel acquiesced to the command and jolted up from the ground. The man firmly grabbed the reins and swiftly swung over the side of the camel. We've overstayed our welcome. Hold on, he said to Abdul-Ahad while kicking the sides of the camel with his heels. The camel dashed out of the village with a blinding speed, leaving nothing more than a dust cloud in its wake. Abdul-Ahad was helpless. He could only look on, drained of life. As the camel sped off with the two men, Abdul-Ahad could only see his village slip away into the distance. Dust scattered around the entrails of the camel, like an out-of-control swarm of bees hovering around a beehive. After about an hour of riding, the camel downshifted to a moderate gallop. Abdul-Ahad had begun to regain his senses and properly asserted himself on the backside of the camel. My name is Ahmed Fahad. I'm famous around these parts. Abdul-Ahad. Abdul-Ahad. Good to make your acquaintance. This is Jamal, my trusted steed. We have been to the edge of the earth and back. He saved my life more times than I can care to remember. It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance. Can I ask, where might we be going? Ahmed said confidently, We are headed to the royal palace. There is a goat path that leads up the mountain. It is not known to many. Abdul-Ahad shook his head at the proclamation and began to laugh at the man. Ahmed looked back with a displeased gaze. Most would be grateful to meet the wise, the all-knowing King Fateh Khan, let alone be rescued by the world-famous Ahmed Fahad. Rescued? You didn't think they were going to let you best their man without coming back for revenge, did you? Sassanians don't take kindly to that sort of thing. Sassanians never travel alone, and they always remember. The thumping. Yes, the thumping. Sassanian war drums. And based on how you hoisted their friend like a skewered piece of kebab, you didn't make too many allies last night. Sassanians. They come from the Far East. They roam from country to country, pillaging and plundering whatever they can get their grubby hands on. And now they are here in Afghanistan. The camel's pace lessened to a brisk stroll as it led the men up the trail to the palace. The palace was highly guarded and braced against the back of a mountain. "Now when we get in there, let me do all the talking. Understand, Abdul-Ahad?" "By all means. It's not every day that I get rescued by the famous Ahmed Fahad," Abdul-Ahad said in jest to his new companion. As the pair rode up the narrow path to the palace, the time passed as fast as leaves falling off a cherry blossom tree in the dead of winter. Before the men knew it, their banter was interrupted by powerful treble. "Who goes there?" a guardsman yelled from behind the gate with a stentorian voice. The voice of the guardsman carried well beyond the boundaries of the palace and lathered the exterior courtyard surrounding the palace walls. The walls of the palace were almost as high as the cypress trees and other arboreous species that littered the mouth of the valley. The walls of the palace were varnished pine wood, soaked over years in black paint. Abdul-Ahad dismounted from the camel and began to approach the gates of the palace. Before he could utter a word, his compatriot gleefully introduced himself. "I am Ahmed Fahad, son of Muhammad ibn Fahad, grandson of the great Yawar Abi, the famous Ahmed Fahad." The guardsmen both stared at Ahmed with a high degree of lugubrious ambivalence. One of the guardsmen pointed to Abdul-Ahad and asked, "And the boy, is he famous too?" Ahmed Fahad dismounted his camel and said, "This is Abdul-Ahad, son of Azim, grandson of Yoriz. And this is Jamal, my trusty steed. What is your business at the palace?" "We must speak to the king at once. Sassanians are invading."